This September will mark the 20th anniversary of Microsoft's historic buyout of British studio Rare. Founded in 1985, the Twycross-based outfit has now been part of Xbox Game Studios for over half its lifetime. Rare are best known today for Sea of Thieves, the multiplayer pirate role-player, where gamers can set sail and craft their own adventures in a flexible and friendly sandbox. But to many, Rare will be defined by their 8-year tenure as Nintendo's right-hand men. Between 1994 and 2002, the team enjoyed a victory lap across 2 console generations. Rare were responsible for rebooting the Donkey Kong franchise with cutting-edge technology, inventing the modern console FPS with GoldenEye 64, and creating a new audience of collectathon diehards with Banjo-Kazooie. Not only did they reinvigorate a gaming icon, but it's arguable that Rare kept their parent company afloat during the N64's content drought. Unfortunately, their time under the Xbox brand hasn't been as fondly remembered. Rare's return to older franchises failed to entice old fans, and their fresh ideas didn't carry the weight or significance of their Nintendo output. This downturn came to a head when they became the sole developers for Microsoft's Avatars and Kinect projects. However, it seemed as if Rare's new relationship was doomed from the start. First impressions are everything, and theirs was 2003's Grabbed by the Ghoulies. For many that had grown up on the studio's collectathons, Rare's flagship Xbox game confirmed fears of mismanagement under Microsoft. Ghoulies was not a new entry in a familiar franchise, but instead a strange beat-em-up with none of the size nor splendour of their N64 work. It was a grim omen that one of gaming's greatest developers would no more. Very few played the game on release, and its biggest detractors today only know of his infamy through cultural osmosis. Even Rare weren't above poking fun at the reception of their first Xbox game. Ghoulies' notoriety has softened in the wake of more high-profile blunders, to the extent that this release is almost forgotten. But to paraphrase pop star David Bowie, we can't change time, but time might change us. Grabbed by the Ghoulies is the game that killed Rare, but with almost 2 decades of hindsight, it has become an exemplar of just how exciting the studio's output has been under Microsoft's tenure. Like those games, Ghoulies is unexpected but exceptional, a great introduction not just to the genre it riffs on, but to why Rare have been a top-tier developer for almost 40 years. If ghosts are echoes of the past that haunt the present, then Grabbed by the Ghoulies is a much-needed exorcism. Grabbed by the Ghoulies is a game that's infamous not so much for its content, but the context surrounding it. Before evaluating the game, its unfortunate reputation must be analysed. As stated, Rare had built an enticing portfolio of work under Nintendo's management, and it seemed as if their relationship would only strengthen in the GameCube era. In 2002, the British studio made an appeal to their bosses to buy more stake in the business. But the Japanese giant wasn't interested. Rare hadn't slighted Nintendo, but rather the cost of games development had skyrocketed, and this deal was too expensive to make. Nintendo had lost an enormous amount of money on the N64, and needed to recoup that in the upcoming era. Yet a company that had and still has a lot of money is the American computer giant Microsoft, who in 2002 released their very first home console, the Xbox. In a shock to many, this new heavyweight bought Rare in its entirety to the tune of $375 million. This purchase made fans and game industry analysts scratch their heads, but it made some business sense. Rare wasn't bought just for their portfolio and prestige, but also their expertise. The Xbox was poised to take over the living room, but its appeal was severely limited. It was winning over swaths of mature gamers due to its PC credentials, huge design, macho marketing, and the allure of Halo Combat Evolved. But this group only constituted a small slice of the potential market. Sony PlayStation owners leaned younger, and Nintendo younger still, making these consoles far more appealing purchases to, well, just about everyone. If Microsoft were to survive the generation, they would have to adapt for this new audience. Early on, the Xbox's infamously rugged controllers were redesigned into svelte devices fitting for regular hands. Rare were purchased to provide the software to drive this new hardware, creating titles that could appeal beyond American fraternities. On paper, it was a great deal. Nintendo's former proteges, given the same budget and creative allowance they were used to, now working in a field with little to no contest. All they needed to do was create games that justified the Xbox as a viable, family-friendly alternative to Nintendo's GameCube. Easier said than done, especially when expectations were at an all-time high. Rare were, at one time, the most transparent developers within the industry. One means they built this reputation was by having an open line of communication between fans and their developers, leveraging their website to do so. Here is where much of Ghoulies' development history has been documented, and thanks to Rare's enormous popularity, much of it has been properly archived. In fact, it was during my research that I discovered a Q&A session from 2004, where a 13-year-old me had asked the team how they came about the idea of Grabbed by the Ghoulies. No, I'm not kidding. That is, unfortunately, me. Most of Rare's conceptualization began with a core idea. For Banjo, it was what gameplay they could get out of their protagonist, whilst GoldenEye was an exercise in making Virtua Cop work on the N64. Grabbed by the Ghoulies started with that name, a joke amongst the blokes in Rare's office. From there, the concept of a haunted house adventure sprung forth. Aimed at a younger audience, they used cultural touchstones like Scooby-Doo, silent movies, and British horror to further style the idea. It was familiar to their previous work, and in fact the game had been conceptualized and partially built for the Nintendo GameCube before the Microsoft buyout. But this wasn't the only thing that inspired the game's design. Grabbed by the Ghoulies was that team's follow-on from the enormous Banjo-Tooie. Not just enormous in regards to sales, but also scale. That Nintendo 64 game was the apex of Rare's achievements on that console. A sprawling, non-linear adventure game, closer in design to Morrowind than Mario 64. Its world was a magnitude of size larger than Banjo-Kazooie, with levels designed not like enclosed snow globes, but instead interconnected places. Objectives were more sophisticated and could overlap between multiple biomes, making the game feel like a true gargantuan quest to undertake. But Grabbed by the Ghoulies was designed to contrast. Although critically and commercially successful, the team were aware that Banjo-Tooie's enormous size was off-putting to most players. It was unlikely everyone would see the ending, let alone complete the game top to bottom. Ghoulies would be an exercise in creating an adventure that was short and initially easy to complete. However, it would also have a hook to its design that encouraged players looking for a harder challenge to replay it. This is why the context around Grabbed by the Ghoulies release is so important, because if Rare had continued to be a Nintendo subsidiary, and the game was released after Banjo-Tooie and in between another elaborate game like Star Fox Adventures, it's incredibly likely Ghoulies would be more fondly remembered. Another fine title in Rare's catalogue, and a demonstration of their flair for arcade sensibility. Of course, it's also very likely the game would be directly compared to Nintendo's own Luigi's Mansion. However, Grabbed by the Ghoulies was their first game after they were, in the eyes of their younger fans, snatched away from Nintendo by Microsoft. For those following Rare from Banjo-Tooie, Ghoulies did not exceed the high standard set by that game. Its presentation and even gameplay was wildly different to the comfortable collectathon genre this audience was used to. Critics at the time were fond of the game's concepts, though critical in regard to Rare's previous accomplishments. More so, this project did not appeal to the older audience that was buying Xbox consoles. With little marketing grunt behind it, sales never quite materialized. Grabbed by the Ghoulies would be dead on arrival. It's strange to think just how different things are today. Microsoft would eventually shake their macho image in later years, going from an aggressive direct competitor to one of a content provider. Services like XBLA and Game Pass give a platform to games that don't fit the convention of a traditional release, and many Microsoft-published titles appear on the Nintendo Switch in an appeal to its younger audience. As for Nintendo, their fortunes would change after the GameCube era, when they shifted focus to the successors of their handheld devices, initially by catering to non-gamers, and then focusing on flexible experiences. As for Rare, they would continue to defy their image of a has-been developer. Their handling of the Banjo franchise was an indicator of this new ethos. Whilst they could have gone the ukulele route and attempt to recreate a 3D platformer past its heyday, the Banjo team instead made nuts and bolts, evolving on the concept of the collectathon by letting players be in charge of how they collected trinkets. The game certainly has its fans, and its image has aged gracefully as more players have been exposed to it. Rare's forward-thinking approach finally got the recognition it deserved with Sea of Thieves, one of the best demonstrations for Microsoft's Game Pass service. Grabbed by the Ghoulies then has been left untouched by time, mostly forgotten outside of its infamy. It has left zero influence on game developers at large, and that is a shame because its core concept is one that could, and absolutely should, be brought up to date. Grabbed by the Ghoulies is, according to Wikipedia, a 3D action-adventure game with beat-em-up elements. Following the exploits of spiky-haired everyman Cooper, he must rescue his girlfriend Amber and escape from the clutches of Gorehaven Hall, a haunted mansion teeming with monsters. These are the titular Ghoulies that have grabbed the protagonist and their spouse. This genre signifier isn't exact, and underplays what's great about the title. The circumstances of the Microsoft buyout would limit some of Grabbed by the Ghoulies' potential. The game had been envisioned as being somewhat non-linear like Banjo-Kazooie, fitting for a game set in a haunted mansion like Resident Evil. But deadlines required that feature to be omitted, so instead Ghoulies is an adventure in the style of RE4, a linear romp through combat arenas and escalating set pieces. Funnily enough, deadlines would also be the reason for RE4's particular design. Rather than feeling like a serious restriction, it allows Ghoulies to be well paced. Each unique combat arena is a room or building on the grounds of the mansion, and the story might have the player character backtrack through these areas a few times. Players cannot freely explore Gorehaven Hall, and instead are filtered from one room to the next as the story dictates. This is a necessity, as each room and their subsequent encounter is designed to ratchet up the challenge each time. So what about that secondary element, the beat-em-up? It's a genre that Rare are no strangers to, considering they develop Battletoads. Once a popular format in arcades, beat-em-ups struggled to find their footing on home consoles due to their sensibilities. As video games eventually hit the mainstream, smaller experiences like this would eventually return. One of the earliest examples of an appealing 3D brawler was Sega's Die Hard Arcade, a port of Japan's Dynamite Decker starring Bruce Willis. The next generation would expand on the concept, with titles like Power Stone, Def Jam Vendetta, and Square's The Bouncer. Each title finds a new wrinkle to exploit, Capcom's flair for special moves, early 2000s hip-hop cool, and the presentation of Square's Final Fantasy games. But in recent years, the 3D brawler hasn't so much faded out, but instead been folded into other genres. Sega's Yakuza series has main character Kazuma Kiryu get into 3D brawls, in between playing minigames and completing RPG-like quests. Rocksteady's Arkham series would then ratify the look and feel of 3D brawling for years to come, making it a part of Batman's stew of platforming and puzzle solving. All of this is to say then that Grabbed by the Ghoulies was still something of a novel concept back in 2003. Unlike Power Stone or Def Jam, Rare's romp was ostensibly a single-player campaign. Although two combatants had been prototyped, co-op was a feature cut due to time constraints. Ghoulies then is a classic belt scroller, very much in the vein of Square's The Bouncer. But where that game was an evolution on Dream Factory's previous fighting games, Rare essentially started their concept from scratch. They were a developer best known for games aimed at a younger audience, and that meant creating onboarding experiences to sometimes complex genre fare. This, combined with the already simple premise of a beat-em-up, should make Ghoulies a slight experience. And yet, Rare are able to make the basic combat of Ghoulies satisfying, without making it convoluted. Instead of calling Ghoulies a beat-em-up, which conjures the image of Final Fight or Streets of Rage, instead I'd call it a combat puzzle game. Not in a means like Gem Fight or a Tetris Battle Gaiden, but rather Grab by the Ghoulies combat encounters are designed to be solved like an elaborate puzzle. This is why it has the structure it does, because each combat arena is a tailored task that must be completed in order to move on to the next. So, how does this work in practice? In a standard brawler, the only rule is that a screen must be cleared of enemies in order to move ahead, and that is true of Grab by the Ghoulies' earliest challenges. But sometimes a player may be asked to do that under a strict time limit, or avoid attacking a specific breed of monster. They might be asked to attack using only props, or instead avoid fighting altogether and find a key hidden in the room. That's why the game is a combat puzzle, because each encounter has conditions to be met in order to proceed. Compared to just wailing on an enemy until they fall over, this requires some additional brain power that makes the simple combat not so simple. Grab by the Ghoulies is so tailored in its combat design that even Cooper's health is set between each arena, which shifts initial difficulty on a room-by-room basis. Fortunately, there are health items and power-ups that can be found amongst the environment, but seeking them out comes with its own risk. They're part of a larger set of questions to be answered to arrive at a solution. Unlike a belt scroller, progress resets almost to zero with each new encounter, much like how a puzzle level will start from an initial unsolved state. It avoids the issue of a player having to keep a full health bar across 20-minute long levels, which was often the annoyance of older 2D fighters. Nearly every arena in Grab by the Ghoulies is designed to be solved in under a minute, and resetting back to that initial state happens quickly after a failure. This is good because a player is going to want to experiment and iterate until they find a satisfying combat solution. Initially, these challenges are simple, and a player may be asked to only fulfill one condition at a time. The game escalates when challenges are overlaid onto each other, even in a means where it makes no sense. How can you fight monsters without attacking them? Well, that's the puzzle to be solved. A player will still have access to their normal controls, so it's a means of figuring out how they can be used within both the temporary and permanent rules Grab by the Ghoulies plays by. Rare created a recipe book of sorts for how to make brawling more interesting than just brawling, and it's ultimately the juice of Ghoulies' arcade sensibilities. Because conditions are so locked down, the rest is left to a player to figure out, and that includes whether they follow the rules. Failing a condition isn't an instant game over, and instead opens up more opportunities. Though I'll get into that when talking about the game's cast of monsters. Like the best puzzle games, there is often more than one solution to solving a combat arena in Grab by the Ghoulies. This is where the replay element shines the brightest, because technology is learned across the entire game, and that can be applied in earlier runs to solve these puzzles quicker and cleaner. This want to replay and improve does require the moment-to-moment gameplay to be engaging, however. Grab by the Ghoulies is still a beat-em-up mechanically, and it successfully achieves the three most important elements that makes this genre sing: combat feel, arena architecture, and most importantly, opponent design. Grab by the Ghoulies employs a control scheme atypical from traditional beat-em-ups. The left stick moves Cooper freely in all directions, and the right stick throws out attacks in the direction it's tapped. Even today, this means of fighting is strange compared to traditional button inputs, but it makes perfect sense for Ghoulies' design. The game is fully 3D, and the camera is placed so that a player can see all enemies that can fully encircle around Cooper. In an older brawler, a character will always attack from the direction they're facing, but Ghoulies allows attacks to be independent of forward movement. This is good because it allows a few hits to be put in even during evasion. Although there is a light amount of aim assist, there is no reticule to choose which monster is being attacked. It stops a player focusing on just one enemy at a time, and that 360-degree circle of attack allows all monsters in Cooper's vicinity to be hit. This combat system is comparable to 2009's Batman Arkham Asylum, which too was designed around the main character fighting multiple foes in 3D arenas. However, camera control is placed on the right stick, which means that aiming attacks has to be balanced with moving Batman. It feels more polished, but in that polish is a lack of player input that Ghoulies has in abundance. This control scheme has a lot in common with twin-stick shooters, and that goes for how simple it is overall. Only 2 face buttons and the shoulders are used during the combat layer, the latter to rotate the camera clockwise and counter around the character, and A and B are used to pick up and drop props respectively. The full range of face buttons are only used during QuickTime event sections, which rarely overlap with the combat. It's a design that allows all the important function buttons to be accessible at once, because a player will constantly be rotating the camera, moving their character and throwing out attacks in these skirmishes, and so thumbs and index fingers are in constant use. It also feels arcadey, like the game's progression system. Grabbed by the Ghoulies could have had an arcade machine interface, which were built to be somewhat simple to keep maintenance and production costs low. On the flip side, it appeals to more players as a result, as there's fewer buttons to consider. A great fit for Rare's desire for Ghoulies to be an entry point to their Xbox work. Most of the time, the player will be throwing out kicks, punches, and body slams. Combos can be employed to move and stun enemies, which allows some much needed enemy juggling when dealing with large crowds. However, there are no unique moves, counterattacks, or means to throw out defense like other brawlers. Instead, the game gets a unique flavour to its combat through its use of props. This isn't a new feature to beat-em-ups, but Ghoulies is unique in its approach. The tone the game goes for is slapstick, somewhere in between Laurel and Hardy and Jackie Chan. From the latter is the need to improvise during a hectic situation, grabbing any matter of things and employing them within combat. The former is comedic whimsy, and to that end Ghoulies is a success. In an early arena set in a pool room, hitting a skeleton with a cue and watching them fly across the room is funny. The same is true when the player character spins the table and turns 15 or so skeletons into bone meal. Fortunately, every room in Grabbed by the Ghoulies is designed for maximum prop potential, and few overlap in functionality and form. At the cost of weapon degradation, they can increase Cooper's range, his attack power, and even bestow new abilities. Candles, for example, spread fire. One more addition to these items are ranged weapons. They are non-degradable, but come at the cost of locking Cooper out of using other props. These turn the control scheme very much into a twin-stick shooter, as holding the right stick in a direction will send a projectile there. They have ammo, though it's abstracted and replenishes automatically. Often given by the large cast of NPCs, Rare employ these ranged weapons every so often to break up combat. It's unfortunate though that they can't be naturally found in the environment. More so, it's annoying that they are often the only solution for some combat encounters. To talk briefly about the look of the game, Grabbed by the Ghoulies has a style quite unlike anything else that was on the Xbox at the time. Norm has been seen since. The game employs lineless cel-shaded rendering, similar to Nintendo's Wind Waker. Rather than attempt to recreate the look of photorealism, instead the developers evoke their own concept art. Shading is simplified to solid bands of colour that can change under real-time lighting. Character proportions are stylised, giving them all the personality of Rare's classic characters without leaning too hard on those tropes. This is even better for its cast of monsters, who employ strong silhouettes and sound design that make them easy to identify even in the heat of battle. Even the world itself has a standout look, employing a no straight lines modelling technique evocative of hand-drawn cartoons. But my only criticism of the game does stem somewhat from its aesthetics. How the story of Grabbed by the Ghoulies is told is lackluster. Although it's impossible to know whether it was intentional or limitation, cutscenes play out as motion comic, and dialogue is delivered in the style of silent movie placards. It avoids the need for characters to be animated in world or given complex voice acting, but it pulls a player out of the experience. Arguably, story presentation is less important in a game like Ghoulies, but it does often feel a little cheap. especially in situations where what should be game-changing moments play out in flat panels. It's fortunate then that the storytelling accounts for only a fraction of the game's runtime, and Ghoulies' most important players are found outside of this static presentation. A brawler is only as good as what you're brawling. Unfortunately, Grabbed by the Ghoulies has a unique cast of monsters that make this combat sing. In his video on the original Doom, GameMaker's Toolkit mentions Harvey Smith's GDC talk on orthogonal unit differentiation. This is a term used to denote creating enemy types that don't overlap in functionality. This creates a chain of command, as players will have to figure out which threat must be dealt with more immediately. That's why in Doom there are ranged enemies, slow-moving melee enemies, and enormous variations in between. Grabbed by the Ghoulies then is that Doom philosophy, but applied to a brawler and a cast plucked out of a haunted house attraction. Skeletons and zombies are your standard humanoid brawlers, but even they are differentiated. The former are quick but low on health, whilst the latter are slow and hearty. When used together, they create a challenge in that their off-rhythm combat requires a player to account for when they may attack. Again, Ghoulies compares favourably to a game like Arkham Asylum, where almost all enemy combatants are exactly the same, differentiated only by temporary melee weapons. Ghoulies' setting also allows enemy types atypical to just humanoids. The first Ghoulie introduced are imps, who come in a number of different variations, and are your classic small, weak, quick-moving and annoying enemy type. Then there's spiders. Usually I'm not a fan of seeing arachnids of any kind in games, but the ones in Ghoulies I dig. One reason is because of their sound design, which rather than going for realism, instead sounds like a middle-aged man squeaking like a mouse and making slurping sounds. Their attacks also aren't particularly realistic. Apart from spitting webs on the ground, their main form of offence is rising into the air and blanket balling the protagonist. Not to dissect the frog, but this joke attack plays well with enemy types who are otherwise planted on the ground, and use short-range melee. Nearly all the enemies in Grabbed by the Ghoulies have this kinda surprising tech to their attacks. The first time I encountered worms, I wondered what new combat rare could get out of small enemies with no arms. Then they swelled up and started to count down to an explosion. It's only now writing this script that I realised that this is a reference to Team 17's classic PC game. What's cool about this explosive attack, other than being completely unexpected, is that it does overlap with other enemies. The Ghoulies aren't a single force, and like Doom's monsters, can be baited into attacking each other. This is why I mentioned earlier that some puzzles can be solved without ever throwing a single attack. If you can kite an enemy just right, or find a special item in some arenas, enemies will turn on each other. Although not a simulation game by any means, this kind of system overlap really gives Ghoulies its edge, especially because it's something a player will discover naturally through play. And nowhere is this more apparent than when Grabbed by the Ghoulies' most unique enemy. Those players that can't follow the conditions set by an arena will evoke the wrath of the Grim Reaper. First named Greg. Their design follows the scythe-wielding skeleton in a black cloak that has been in the public consciousness for centuries, although uncharacteristically they shed on said scythe whenever they get a kill. Just a single touch from Greg can stop the heart of the main protagonist, resetting an arena to its initial state. However, that one-hit kill also applies to any entity in an environment. This includes monsters that can only be destroyed by elements not every arena will purposefully include. The inclusion of the Reaper is a failing forward idea. They're a difficult enemy to evade, especially in a packed environment, but for players that are feeling brash or have figured out timing, they can be a valuable ally. The game only asks a few times for Greg to be evoked to complete a challenge, but more often than not, I just use them to speed up a challenge. It didn't feel like a cheat because I still had to avoid getting hit myself. Like enemy behaviours, the Reaper in Microcosm is what's neat about Grabbed by the Ghoulies. It's a number of very simple systems that overlap into something more robust, like a delicious stew made out of stock ingredients. Most importantly, nearly all these systems can be pulled at by the player, letting them tailor their experience to a specific liking. It might not look like Streets of Rage, but Grabbed by the Ghoulies is a true beat-em-up. Combat is satisfying, Arenas have plentiful opportunities, and opponents are all unique actors that are fun to engage with. Leaning into the opportunities of its haunted house setting, Rare could break some of the rules of the genre to create something far more interesting. It's Resident Evil 4 if Leon was stripped of permanent weapons and his health was adjusted battle by battle. Also if the Ganados sometimes included tiny ninjas and buxom vampires. Context is important, but removing Grabbed by the Ghoulies from its historical baggage lets its fine design shine. Rare's greatest achievement with a title is always finding new means to use its simple systems to create brand new situations, even up until the end. In comparison to Banjo-Tooie, it didn't have to keep introducing new control interfaces and special abilities to keep a player engaged. It could reuse old rooms, old props and familiar conditions, but remix them in a means not seen previously. Not every activity is a winner, but these puzzle rooms come so thick and fast that one is going to stick with a player. In fact, the one downside of the game is that Rare doesn't get to squeeze all the juice out of the concept. Additional challenges unlocked by hidden items does go some way though to satisfying that want, but it only goes so far. This is why I think Grabbed by the Ghoulies should have gotten a second chance. The game ends on a cliffhanger of more hijinks to come, and the final product already had plenty of unrealized potential. A second attempt could reintroduce that Metroidvania-like non-linearity, and let players have some choice and progression. Reinstating two-player co-op would also be massively appreciated. But beyond that, the team could look at how Doom 2 evolved over its predecessor, bring back its best ghoulies and add a few more that complement their differentiation. Add a few more props, and make ranged weapons optional. Make environmental destruction useful beyond just treasure hunting, like kicking over a water barrel to create a vector for electricity. Speaking of treasure hunting, if co-op is implemented, then having a high score system could drive competition. There doesn't really need to be any more conditions added, but if so, have them play with the environment. A battle royale shrinking area of safety, or a constantly moving area of safety, for example. It'd have players on their toes without ever feeling unnatural. I mean, hey, the concept even has a great inbuilt sequel name, Grabbed by the Toolies. It wouldn't even have to worry about releasing on a console best known for Halo either. It could have been a XBLA classic, or a great fit for modern day Game Pass. There's very few 3D brawlers on the market, especially ones like Grabbed by the Ghoulies, so any kind of title that achieves these wants would be massively appreciated. Grabbed by the Ghoulies was an early glimpse of what Rare's Microsoft output would look like. And I'd say that as a positive. Titles like Viva Pinata, Cameo Elements of Power, Nuts and Bolts and Sea of Thieves are all great, and I'll even go to bat and say that their Kinect Sports titles make both the Kinect and sports enjoyable. At their core, they're unlike anything else other developers are making, and to a quality that rivals their former bosses. The avatars and Kinect would have been forgotten flukes if given to other developers, but much like Nintendo made the Wii a viable hit, Rare did the same for those services. But it's a joy that in the year 2022, one of my favourite developers has scored a new legion of fans thanks to Sea of Thieves. I have high hopes for their next game, Everwild, and whatever else they might be working on. It's just a shame that the rising cost of game development means waiting for the next big Rare game takes longer every year. At least their old work still exists, and is still very available. Following its remaster for 2015's Rare Replay collection, I hope more people will consider revisiting Grabbed by the Ghoulies, especially to enjoy a remastered version in high definition and a locked 60 frames per second. For most, it might be the first time they ever play the game. Considering how unique a title it is amongst Rare's own output, 3D brawlers and adventure games, it might feel like a modern, hyper-polished indie, and not like a game that was released when Bush was in the White House. Grabbed by the Ghoulies wasn't undone by compromises, it was built by them. It wasn't Banjo-Tooie by design, in the hope of creating a game to appeal beyond just fans. It couldn't be an open world, and instead embraced linearity. It was a children's game on a console bought by frat boys, and so Rare would have to fire on all cylinders to make it a viable competitor to Nintendo's own work. In that respect, it's a miracle, even when its flaws are taken into account. In the years since, titles like Resident Evil 4 and Luigi's Mansion have been reappraised for their subversive design, and Grabbed by the Ghoulies deserves similar recognition. It is one of the finest adventures one can undertake on the Xbox, with a combat loop that keeps you hooked all the way past a first playthrough. It's a little crummy looking and lacking in some departments, but nearly every old video game is like that. What separates it from the likes of bottom-of-the-barrel fighting games is a strange heart. Scooby-Doo rendering, quirky humour, monsters that both riff on familiar looks and totally unexpected source materials. From some angles, Grabbed by the Ghoulies is the Jackie Chan game I've always wanted. Sometimes it's a frustrating game of comical error. But throughout it all, it is totally a Rare title. Writing this video has finally got me to realise why I still buy Rare's games, in spite of others having fallen out with them. That's because they're a developer that's willing to try something new, even in the face of complete obscurity. I loved their games on the N64 for that very reason, because Rare were happy to challenge the conventions of even brand new genres and make them their own. GoldenEye could have just been Nintendo's Virtua Cop, but instead it pioneered a new design that allowed Halo to exist. Banjo-Kazooie, and Tooie after it, took Mario 64's template and gave it some much needed character. But eventually these ideas had to evolve, and Rare and those they inspired did so with vision. So let me ask, why continue living in a ghost house when Rare is still alive and thriving today? So a happy 20th anniversary to Rare under Microsoft, and a happy 19th birthday to the game that started this entire endeavour. A haunted house romp with a title that's slang for getting your testicles squeezed.